Imagine waking up tomorrow in the year 1095, in a world where taking a simple bath could literally kill you, where your morning coffee doesn't exist, and where the bathroom is a shared hole in the ground that hasn't been cleaned in months. You think you're tough? You think you could handle medieval life? Well, settle in, because tonight we're going to gently explore why you listening to this right now, wouldn't survive even a single day during the Crusades. So close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift back nearly 1,000 years to discover just how brutal and fascinating life really was during one of history's most tumultuous periods. The year is 1095, and Pope Urban II has just delivered his famous speech at the Council of Clermont, calling for the First Crusade. You've somehow found yourself transported back in time, and you're about to experience what millions of people lived through during this extraordinary period of history. But first, let's start with something simple: waking up. It's still dark when you're jolted awake, not by an alarm clock, which won't be invented for another 800 years, but by the sound of church bells ringing for lauds, the morning prayer that begins before dawn. The temperature in your small room is barely above freezing, even though it's supposedly summer. There's no central heating, no electric blankets, no thermostats. The only warmth comes from the dying embers of a fire that you had to keep burning all night, assuming you could afford the wood. Your bed isn't the comfortable mattress you're used to. Instead, you're lying on a straw-filled sack that's probably home to fleas, lice, and other creatures you'd rather not think about. The straw hasn't been changed in months, and it's beginning to rot, giving off a musty organic smell that would make your modern nose wrinkle in disgust. Your pillow is a smaller sack filled with feathers if you're lucky, or more straw if you're not. But here's where your day starts to go really wrong. You need to use the bathroom. In your time, this means a quick walk to a private, clean, well-lit room with running water, toilet paper, and privacy. In 1095, this means stumbling through the dark to find the communal latrine, a wooden seat positioned over a deep pit that serves the entire household or village. There's no toilet paper. Instead, you'll use whatever's available: leaves, moss, or if you're fortunate, some scraps of cloth that have been used by countless others before you. The smell is overwhelming. The latrine hasn't been cleaned or emptied in months, and the waste below has fermented into a toxic soup that produces gases so potent they can actually make you sick. Many people in medieval times suffered from what we now know were respiratory problems caused by the constant inhalation of methane and hydrogen sulfide from these primitive sewage systems. And privacy? Forget about it. These latrines often accommodate multiple people at once, and conversations during bathroom breaks are perfectly normal. The concept of personal privacy that you take for granted simply doesn't exist. Now, let's talk about getting clean. You might think, well, at least I can wash my hands afterward. But here's the thing: soap as you know it doesn't exist yet. The closest thing available is a harsh, lye-based substance that's more likely to burn your skin than clean it. Most people simply rinse their hands in cold water, if water is available at all. Taking a bath? That's a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even then, it's a rare occurrence. Most people bathe only a few times a year, if that. The common belief is that bathing too frequently can actually make you sick by opening your pores to disease. Water itself is often contaminated with bacteria, parasites, and waste, making every drink a potential death sentence. Your clothes are another nightmare. You're wearing the same wool tunic and hose that you've worn for weeks, possibly months. Laundry is an enormous undertaking that involves hauling water, making lye soap, and spending entire days scrubbing clothes by hand. Most people own only 1 or 2 sets of clothing, which means you're constantly wearing dirty, smelly, and often lice-infested garments. The fabric itself is rough and scratchy, nothing like the soft cotton or synthetic blends you're used to. Wool is the primary material, and it's often poorly processed, leaving it coarse and irritating against your skin. Undergarments are minimal or non-existent, so that rough wool is in direct contact with your body all day long. But let's say you've somehow managed to get dressed and deal with your basic bodily needs. Now you need breakfast. In your time, this might mean cereal, toast, eggs, coffee, orange juice, a variety of options that you can prepare quickly and easily. In 1095, breakfast is whatever you can find or afford, and it's probably not much. If you're a peasant, which statistically you almost certainly would be, your breakfast consists of dark, coarse bread that's often moldy, some thin porridge made from whatever grains are available, and perhaps some ale or watered-down wine. Fresh fruits and vegetables are rare and seasonal. Meat is a luxury that most people see only on special occasions. The bread deserves special mention because it's so different from what you know. Medieval bread is dense, heavy, and often contains sawdust, chalk, or other fillers to stretch the grain. It's frequently contaminated with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and death. Eating your daily bread could literally drive you insane. And that ale you're drinking for breakfast? It's not because medieval people were alcoholics. It's because the water is so contaminated that alcohol is often the only safe thing to drink. The brewing process kills most bacteria, making ale and wine safer than water. But this also means that everyone, including children, is slightly intoxicated most of the time. Now let's talk about your job, because in medieval times, everyone works and everyone works hard. If you're a peasant farmer, your day involves backbreaking labor in the fields using primitive tools. Plows are made of wood and are barely more effective than digging with your hands. There are no tractors, no mechanized equipment, no power tools of any kind. Everything is done by human or animal power. The work is dangerous. Farm accidents are common and often fatal. A simple cut from a scythe can become infected and kill you within days. There are no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no understanding of germ theory. A minor injury that would be trivial today could easily end your life in medieval times. The concept of retirement doesn't exist. You work until you're physically unable to continue, and then you depend on your family or the church for survival. Most people don't live long enough to worry about retirement anyway. The average life expectancy is somewhere between 30 and 40 years, assuming you survive childhood, which many don't. Speaking of survival, let's talk about the medical care available to you in 1095. If you get sick or injured, your options are limited and often more dangerous than the original problem. Medieval medicine is based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors believe that illness is caused by an imbalance of these humors, and their treatments are designed to restore balance. This means that if you have a fever, the doctor might decide you have too much blood and will literally drain blood from your body, using leeches or by cutting your veins. If you have a headache, they might drill a hole in your skull to release the evil spirits causing your pain. If you have a broken bone, they might set it without any pain relief and with no understanding of proper alignment or healing. Anesthesia doesn't exist. Surgery is performed on fully conscious patients who are held down by assistants while the surgeon works. Many people die from shock and pain alone, never mind the actual medical condition being treated. Infection is almost guaranteed because there's no understanding of sterilization or antiseptic procedures. But let's say you've somehow survived your first morning in medieval times. You've dealt with the primitive sanitation, choked down your moldy bread and contaminated ale, and started your back-breaking workday. Now you need to understand the social and political context of the world you found yourself in. The Crusades aren't just a religious war happening somewhere far away. They're a massive social and economic upheaval that affects everyone in medieval society. Entire families are being torn apart as men leave for the Holy Land, often never to return. The economy is being disrupted as resources are diverted to fund the crusading armies. Social structures are being challenged as traditional hierarchies are upset by the massive movement of people and wealth. If you're a peasant, you might be forced to contribute to the crusade through taxes, labor, or military service. Your lord might decide to join the crusade, leaving you without protection or leadership. Bandits and raiders take advantage of the chaos to prey on undefended communities. The roads are dangerous, trade is disrupted, and food shortages are common. The church dominates every aspect of life in ways that would be unimaginable today. You're required to attend Mass regularly, confess your sins to a priest, and pay tithes to the church, even if it means your family goes hungry. The church controls education, healthcare, and social services. It also controls information. Most people are illiterate, and the church decides what knowledge is acceptable and what is heretical. Questioning church authority is not just socially unacceptable, it's literally a matter of life and death. The Inquisition is beginning to take shape, and anyone suspected of heresy can be arrested, tortured, and executed. The church has its own courts, its own laws, and its own enforcement mechanisms that operate outside of secular authority. But perhaps most shocking to your modern sensibilities is the casual acceptance of violence in medieval society. Life is brutal, and death is commonplace. Children die regularly from disease, malnutrition, and accidents. Women die in childbirth at alarming rates. Men die from warfare, work accidents, and violence. The average person witnesses more death and suffering in a year than you might see in a lifetime. This constant exposure to death creates a mindset that's difficult for modern people to understand. Life is seen as temporary and often painful, while death is viewed as a release and a transition to something better. This explains, in part, why so many people were willing to join the Crusades despite the obvious dangers. The promise of eternal salvation was worth the risk of earthly death. Now that we've survived barely our first day in medieval times, let's imagine that you've somehow decided to join the First Crusade. Perhaps the local priest has convinced you that this is your path to salvation. Or maybe you read desperate enough to believe that the promised riches of the East will solve your earthly problems. Whatever your motivation, you're about to embark on a journey that will make your difficult first day seem like a pleasant vacation. The year is now 1096, and the crusading fever has swept across Europe like a plague. Pope Urban II's call for a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem has resonated with people from all walks of life, from peasants to princes. But the reality of what you're about to undertake is far more horrifying than the romantic vision painted by the church as propaganda. Let's start with the preparation for your journey. In your modern world, preparing for a long trip might involve booking flights, making hotel reservations, packing appropriate clothing, and ensuring you have enough money and credit cards. In 1096, preparing for the crusade means selling everything you own, saying goodbye to your family forever, and accepting that you'll probably never see your homeland again. The first challenge is financial. The church has promised that God will provide for those who take the cross, but the reality is that crusading is enormously expensive. You need to purchase weapons, armor, supplies, and transportation for a journey that will last years, not days. A knight's equipment alone costs more than most people earn in a lifetime. If you're a peasant, you'll need to sell your land, your animals, and everything else you own just to afford the basic necessities for the journey. Many crusaders mortgage their property to Jewish moneylenders at ruinous interest rates, knowing they'll never be able to repay the loans if they survive to return home. The weapons and armor available to you are primitive and often inadequate. A sword is a luxury that only the wealthy can afford, and even then, it's made of iron that's prone to breaking or becoming dull. Most crusaders carry spears, clubs, or agricultural tools converted to weapons. Armor, if you can afford it, is heavy, uncomfortable, and provides limited protection. The journey across Europe takes months and is fraught with difficulties. Your army must negotiate passage through the territories of various kings and princes, some of whom are sympathetic to the crusade and others who see you as a threat. The Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV is actually excommunicated and opposed to the crusade, making passage through his territories particularly difficult. When you finally reach Constantinople in late 1096 or early 1097, you're confronted with a city unlike anything you've ever seen. Constantinople is the largest, richest, and most sophisticated city in the Christian world, with a population of several 100,000 people. The city's walls, churches, and palaces are magnificent beyond your imagination. But this magnificence also creates resentment and suspicion among the Crusaders. Many of them come from small, poor communities and are overwhelmed by the wealth and sophistication of the Byzantine capital. They begin to suspect that the Byzantines are more interested in using the Crusaders for their own purposes than in supporting the Holy War. Finally, in the spring of 1097, the crusading armies cross the Bosphorus into Anatolia and begin the real journey to Jerusalem. This is where your ordeal truly begins, because you're now entering territory controlled by the Seljuk Turks, who are determined to stop your advance. The march across Anatolia is one of the most grueling experiences in military history. Anatolia is a vast mountainous region with extreme climate variations and limited water sources. The Seljuk Turks have adopted a strategy of harassment and attrition, avoiding major battles while constantly attacking the crusading armies with hit-and-run tactics. The Turkish tactics are perfectly suited to the terrain and climate. They use light cavalry armed with composite bows to attack the Crusaders and then retreat before the heavy European cavalry can respond. They poison wells, destroy food supplies, and attack stragglers and foraging parties. As you march through Anatolia, you're constantly hungry, thirsty, and exhausted. The army must move slowly to accommodate the infantry and the baggage train, making it vulnerable to Turkish attacks. Foraging parties sent out to find food and water are often ambushed and destroyed. The heat during the day is unbearable, especially when you're wearing heavy armor and carrying weapons and supplies. The sun beats down mercilessly, and there's little shade or relief. Many Crusaders suffer from heat exhaustion and dehydration, and some die from heat stroke. Water is the most critical resource, and it's often contaminated or unavailable. The Turks have poisoned many wells and water sources, and the water that is available is often brackish or polluted. Drinking contaminated water causes dysentery and other waterborne diseases that kill more Crusaders than enemy action. The first major battle occurs at Dorylaeum in July 1097, and it gives you a terrifying preview of what medieval combat actually looks like. Unlike the romanticized version you might have seen in movies, real medieval warfare is chaotic, brutal, and utterly terrifying. The battle begins at dawn when the Turkish forces launch a surprise attack on the crusading army. You're awakened not by gentle sunlight, but by the sound of war cries, galloping horses, and the whistle of arrows flying overhead. The Turks have surrounded your camp during the night, and you're trapped with nowhere to run. The noise is overwhelming, thousands of men shouting, horses screaming, metal clashing against metal, and the constant thrum of bowstrings as Turkish archers rain arrows down on your position. The smell of sweat, blood, and fear fills the air as men around you are struck down by arrows or trampled by horses. The battle lasts all day under the scorching Anatolian sun. You're fighting in temperatures that exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit while wearing metal armor and carrying heavy weapons. Dehydration becomes as dangerous as enemy arrows. Men begin to collapse from heat exhaustion, even when they haven't been wounded. The battle is finally won when reinforcements arrive other crusading armies that had been marching separately. The Turks, faced with fresh troops, finally withdraw. But the victory comes at an enormous cost. Thousands of crusaders are dead or wounded, and the army's morale is shattered. After Dorylaeum, the march continues across Anatolia, but the army is now much more cautious and fearful. The easy confidence that many crusaders felt when they began the journey has been replaced by a grim understanding of what they were really facing. The romantic vision of holy war has been shattered by the brutal reality of medieval combat. The march across Anatolia takes months, and by the time the army reaches Antioch in October 1097, it's a shadow of what it was when it left Constantinople. Thousands of crusaders have died from disease, starvation, exposure, and enemy action. Those who survive are weakened, traumatized, and demoralized. But Antioch presents an even greater challenge than the march across Anatolia. The city is one of the strongest fortresses in the Middle East, with massive walls and a large garrison. The Crusaders are about to begin a siege that will last 8 months and will test their endurance to the breaking point. The siege of Antioch becomes a nightmare of medieval warfare. The city is too large and too well fortified to be taken by assault, so the Crusaders must try to starve it into submission. But the besiegers soon find themselves in worse condition than the besieged. The winter of 1097 to 1098 is particularly brutal. The Crusaders are camped in the open with inadequate shelter and clothing. The rain turns the camp into a sea of mud, and the cold kills many who are already weakened by disease and malnutrition. Firewood is scarce, and many Crusaders freeze to death in their sleep. Food becomes critically scarce as the siege drags on. The army's supply lines are tenuous and often cut by enemy action. Foraging parties must travel farther and farther from the camp to find food, making them vulnerable to attack. The price of food skyrockets, and many Crusaders sell their weapons and armor to buy bread. The siege is finally broken in June 1098, when a traitor inside the city opens one of the gates to the Crusaders. But the capture of Antioch doesn't end the ordeal, it only begins a new phase of suffering. The Crusaders have barely taken the city when they find themselves besieged by a large Muslim army led by Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul. Now the Crusaders are trapped inside the city they've just captured, with inadequate supplies and no hope of relief. The situation is so desperate that many Crusaders consider surrendering or converting to Islam to save their lives. The discovery of what is claimed to be the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side, provides a temporary boost to morale, but it doesn't solve the practical problems of food and water. The final battle for Antioch is fought in a state of near starvation and desperation. The Crusaders are so weak from hunger that many can barely lift their weapons. But desperation gives them a kind of frenzied courage, and they manage to defeat Kerboga's army in a battle that's more of a desperate breakout than a planned military operation. After a year-long pause in Antioch to recover and reorganize, the Crusaders resume their march south toward the Holy City. This final leg of the journey takes them through Syria and Palestine, where they face new challenges and new enemies. The final approach to Jerusalem in June 1099 is both the culmination of the Crusaders' dreams and the beginning of their final ordeal. The sight of the Holy City after 3 years of suffering and sacrifice is overwhelming for many Crusaders. Some fall to their knees and weep at the sight of the walls where Christ was crucified. But Jerusalem is also a formidable fortress, and the Crusaders are now a much smaller and weaker force than when they began their journey. The siege of Jerusalem lasts only 5 weeks, but it's conducted by an army that's at the end of its endurance. The final assault on Jerusalem in July 1099 is a desperate, all-or-nothing attack. The Crusaders know that they lack the resources for a prolonged siege, so they must take the city quickly or face destruction. The attack is successful, but it's followed by a massacre that shocks even the medieval world. The sack of Jerusalem is one of the most brutal episodes in medieval history. The Crusaders, driven by religious fanaticism and years of suffering, show no mercy to the city's inhabitants. Muslims, Jews, and even Eastern Christians are killed indiscriminately. The streets run with blood, and the smell of death fills the air. For you, as a participant in this massacre, the experience would be traumatic beyond description. The sight of innocent people being killed, the screams of women and children, the smell of blood and death, all of this would create psychological scars that would last for the rest of your life. But even the capture of Jerusalem doesn't end the ordeal for most crusaders. The majority of those who survive the journey want nothing more than to return home. But the journey back to Europe is just as dangerous as the journey to the Holy Land. Many crusaders die on the return journey, never seeing their homes again. Those who do make it home find that their world has changed in their absence. Their property may have been sold or seized. Their families may have died or moved away, and their communities may no longer welcome them. Many returning crusaders find themselves homeless and destitute, their sacrifices forgotten or ignored.
Now that we've followed our imaginary crusader through the ultimate medieval ordeal, let us step back and examine what daily life was really like for the vast majority of people who never left their villages, never saw a battlefield, and never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Because even for those who stayed home, medieval life was a constant struggle for survival that would challenge every assumption you have about what constitutes a tolerable existence. Imagine waking up tomorrow not as a crusader, but as a typical medieval peasant in the year 1100. You're living in a small village somewhere in France or England. And your entire world consists of perhaps 50 families scattered across a few square miles of farmland. This is your universe. And for most people in medieval times, it's the only universe they'll ever know. The house you live in would shock you with its primitiveness. It's essentially a single room, perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet, shared by your entire family, parents, children, grandparents, and possibly other relatives. The walls are made of wattle and daba, framework of wooden sticks, covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. The roof is thatched with straw or reeds that leak when it rains and provide minimal insulation against the cold. There are no windows in the modern sense, just small openings that can be covered with wooden shutters or animal skins. Glass is a luxury that only the wealthy can afford. And even then, it's thick, distorted, and provides little visibility. Most of the time, your house is dark, even during the day. The floor is dirt, literally just packed earth that becomes muddy when it rains and dusty when it is dry. There's no foundation, no insulation, no protection from moisture, insects, or rodents. The floor is often covered with rushes or straw that is supposed to provide some comfort and absorb spills. But this organic matter quickly becomes a breeding ground for fleas, lice, and other parasites. Privacy, as we've mentioned before, simply doesn't exist. Every activity, sleeping, eating, dressing, intimate relations takes place in the presence of the entire family. Personal space is a concept that won't be invented for centuries. You've never been alone in your entire life, and you never will be. Your diet is monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. Breakfast, if you have one at all, consists of dark bread and perhaps some thin porridge made from whatever grains are available. The bread is coarse, dense, and often contaminated with sawdust, chalk, or other fillers to stretch the grain supply. Fresh fruits and vegetables are rare and seasonal. Most of your nutrition comes from grains wheat if you're lucky, barley or oats if you're not, and rye or other inferior grains if times are really hard. Meat is a luxury that you might taste a few times a year, usually at religious festivals or special occasions. Your main beverage is ale or watered-down wine, not because you're an alcoholic, but because the water supply is so contaminated that alcohol is often the only safe thing to drink. The brewing process kills most bacteria and parasites, making fermented beverages safer than water. The work that fills your days is backbreaking and dangerous. If you're a man, you're probably a farmer, working small strips of land using primitive tools. Your plow is made of wood and is barely more effective than digging with your hands. You have no mechanized equipment, no power tools, no labor-saving devices of any kind. Farm accidents are common and often fatal. A cut from a scythe can become infected and kill you within days. Being kicked by a horse or ox can break bones that will never heal properly. Even minor injuries can become life-threatening in a world without antibiotics or proper medical care. If you're a woman, your life is equally difficult, but different. You're responsible for managing the household, which includes cooking, cleaning, making clothes, caring for children, and helping with farm work during busy seasons. You're also expected to bear and raise children, a process that's extremely dangerous in medieval times. Childbirth is one of the most dangerous experiences a woman can face. There are no hospitals, no trained doctors, no understanding of hygiene or infection control. Many women die in childbirth, and those who survive often suffer from complications that affect them for the rest of their lives. Child mortality is horrifically high. Perhaps half of all children die before reaching adulthood, victims of disease, malnutrition, accidents, or violence. Parents often do and allow themselves to become emotionally attached to their children until they re-old enough to be likely to survive. The social structure that governs your life is rigid and inescapable. If you're born a peasant, you'll die a peasant. Social mobility is virtually impossible. Your lord owns the land you farm, and you owe him various obligations, labor, military service, and payments in kind. The feudal system that dominates medieval society is based on personal relationships and mutual obligations rather than abstract concepts like citizenship or individual rights. You owe loyalty and service to your lord, and he owes you protection and justice in return. But the relationship is inherently unequal, and the lord has all the real power. You cannot leave your lord's land without permission. You cannot marry without his consent. You cannot sell your property or pass it on to your children without his approval. You're essentially tied to the land and to your lord for your entire life. The legal system that governs your life is arbitrary and often brutal. There are no professional judges, no standardized laws, no concept of due process as we understand it. Justice is administered by your lord or his representatives who may be illiterate, corrupt, or simply absent. Trials often involve supernatural elements. You might be required to undergo trial by ordeal carrying a red-hot iron bar, plunging your hand into boiling water, or being thrown into a pond to see if you float. If you're injured or if you float, you're considered guilty. If you're not injured or if you sink, God has protected you and you're innocent. The church dominates every aspect of your life in ways that would be unimaginable today. You're required to attend Mass regularly, usually several times a week. The services are conducted in Latin, which you don't understand, and they can last for hours. You're expected to stand throughout the service, as pews don't exist yet. You must confess your sins to a priest regularly, revealing the most intimate details of your thoughts and actions to a man who has enormous power over your spiritual and temporal welfare. The priest can impose penances that might involve fasting, pilgrimage, or public humiliation. You're required to pay tithes to the church, typically 1/10 of your income or produce. This is a significant burden for people who are already living at subsistence level. But failure to pay can result in excommunication, which means eternal damnation and social ostracism. The diseases that threaten you are numerous and often fatal. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infectious diseases sweep through communities regularly, killing large numbers of people.
Plague outbreaks are periodic catastrophes that can wipe out entire villages. Even minor injuries can become life-threatening infections. A small cut can develop into gangrene that requires amputation or causes death. Childbirth fever kills many new mothers. Simple respiratory infections can develop into pneumonia that's often fatal. The seasonal cycle dominates medieval life in ways that modern people can barely understand. Winter is a time of near starvation and constant cold. Spring is a time of desperate hope as people plant crops and pray for good weather. Summer is a time of backbreaking labor as crops are tended and harvested. Fall is a time of frantic preparation for the coming winter. The weather has an immediate and dramatic impact on your survival. A late frost can destroy crops and cause famine. Too much rain can rot the grain in the fields. Too little rain can cause drought and crop failure. A harsh winter can kill livestock and exhaust food supplies. You have no weather forecasting, no way to prepare for extreme weather events, no insurance against crop failure. Your survival depends entirely on factors beyond your control, creating a constant sense of anxiety and helplessness. The technology available to you is primitive and largely unchanged for centuries. Your tools are made of wood and iron, powered by human or animal muscle. Your transportation consists of walking or riding in ox-drawn carts over roads that are little more than dirt tracks. Innovation is rare and often viewed with suspicion. New ideas are seen as potentially dangerous or heretical. The dominant philosophy is that the ancients knew everything worth knowing, and the goal is to preserve traditional knowledge rather than discover new truths. The communication systems available to you are slow and unreliable. News travels at the speed of a walking messenger, and information is often distorted as it passes from person to person. You might not learn about major events for weeks or months after they occur. Most people are completely illiterate and have never seen a book. All information is transmitted orally, making it subject to distortion and loss over time. The lack of reliable communication makes coordination difficult and contributes to the fragmentation of medieval society. The entertainment available to medieval peasants is limited and often violent. Popular entertainments include public executions, animal baiting, and various forms of combat. Music and storytelling exist, but they're often focused on themes of death, violence, and religious devotion. Religious festivals provide some relief from the drudgery of daily life, but even these are often somber affairs focused on sin, suffering, and the afterlife rather than joy and celebration. The concept of leisure time as we understand it doesn't really exist. When people aren't working, they're usually engaged in activities that are necessary for survival. Death is a constant presence in medieval life. The average life expectancy is somewhere between 30 and 40 years, and many people die much younger. Infant and child mortality rates are horrifically high. Disease, accident, violence, and malnutrition claim lives regularly. The frequency of death creates a different relationship with mortality than modern people have. Death is seen as a natural and inevitable part of life, rather than as a medical failure or tragedy to be avoided at all costs. Now let's imagine that instead of being a peasant farmer or a crusading knight, you've somehow found yourself in the role of a medieval merchant. Perhaps you think this would be easier. After all, merchants were among the wealthier members of medieval society, and trade might seem like a civilized alternative to farming or fighting. But as we'll discover, medieval commerce was a deadly game of chance that would test every limit of your courage, endurance, and sanity. The year is 1150, and you're a cloth merchant based in the growing city of Bruges in what is now Belgium. Bruges is becoming one of the most important commercial centers in Northern Europe, a hub where English wool meets Flemish weaving skills and Italian banking expertise. You might think this sounds like a promising business environment, but the reality of medieval commerce would shock you with its dangers and difficulties. Your day begins before dawn, not because you want to get an early start on your business, but because the city gates are locked from sunset to sunrise, and you need to be ready to leave as soon as they open. Security is a constant concern in medieval cities, and the gates are heavily guarded against bandits, enemy armies, and other threats. The city itself would assault your modern sensibilities from the moment you step outside. The streets are narrow, unpaved, and ankle-deep in a mixture of mud, animal waste, and human refuse. There are no sewers, no garbage collection, no street cleaning. The smell is overwhelming, a combination of rotting food, human and animal waste, industrial byproducts, and unwashed bodies. Your warehouse, where you store the cloth that forms the basis of your business, is a constant source of worry. There are no insurance companies, no security systems, no reliable protection against theft, fire, or other disasters. You must hire guards to watch your goods, but the guards themselves might steal from you if they're not paid well or supervised carefully. The cloth you're dealing with represents an enormous investment that could bankrupt you if anything goes wrong. A single shipment of high-quality English wool or Flemish cloth might be worth more than most people earn in a lifetime. But this valuable cargo must be transported over hundreds of miles of dangerous roads, through territories controlled by hostile lords, and across rivers and mountains where accidents are common. The transportation available to you is primitive and unreliable. Your goods travel in ox-drawn carts that move at walking speed over roads that are little more than dirt tracks. These roads become impassable in bad weather, are frequently blocked by fallen trees or landslides, and are constantly threatened by bandits and robbers. A journey that would take hours today might take weeks in medieval times. A trip from Bruges to Paris, a distance of about 200 miles, could take 2 weeks or more, depending on weather, road conditions, and security concerns. And every day on the road increases the risk of losing your entire investment to thieves, accidents, or natural disasters. The political situation makes trade even more dangerous and unpredictable. Europe is divided into hundreds of small territories, each with its own ruler, laws, and customs. What's legal in one territory might be forbidden in another. A lord who is friendly to merchants today might decide to confiscate their goods tomorrow if he needs money for war or other expenses. Border crossings are particularly hazardous. Each territory has its own customs officials, tax collectors, and guards who view merchants as sources of revenue. You might have to pay tolls, taxes, and bribes at dozens of different checkpoints during a single journey. These payments can quickly eat up your profits, assuming you're allowed to pass at all. The currency situation is a nightmare of complexity and uncertainty. There's no standardized money system. Each region has its own coins, weights, and measures. A pound of silver in England is different from a pound of silver in France, which is different from a pound of silver in the Holy Roman Empire. Exchange rates fluctuate wildly, and there's no reliable way to determine the true value of foreign coins. Counterfeiting is rampant because there are no sophisticated anti-counterfeiting measures. Coins are often debased with cheaper metals, clipped to remove precious metal, or simply forged entirely. As a merchant, you need to be an expert in metallurgy and coin evaluation just to avoid being cheated in every transaction. The banking system is primitive and often unreliable. Banks exist, but they're small family-owned operations that can fail without warning. There are no government guarantees, no deposit insurance, no regulatory oversight. If your banker dies, goes bankrupt, or simply decides to steal your money, you have little recourse. The seasonal fairs that are central to medieval commerce are both opportunities and ordeals. These gatherings bring together merchants from across Europe, creating markets for goods that would otherwise be impossible to sell. But they also create intense competition, crowded conditions, and numerous opportunities for fraud and theft. The most famous of these fairs are held in the Champagne region of France, where merchants from England, Flanders, Italy, and Germany gather several times a year to trade wool, cloth, spices, and other goods. These fairs are like temporary cities, with thousands of merchants, customers, and hangers-on crowded together for weeks at a time. The conditions at these fairs are appalling by modern standards. Sanitation is non-existent, disease spreads rapidly, and crime is rampant. The local authorities are often overwhelmed by the crowds and unable to maintain order. Fights, thefts, and frauds are daily occurrences. Despite these challenges, the fairs are essential to your business because they are the only places where you can access certain markets and products. Missing a fair can mean losing an entire year's worth of business opportunities. The luxury goods that form a significant part of medieval trade present special challenges. Spices, silk, precious metals, and other high-value items are extremely profitable, but also extremely risky. These goods often come from distant lands through long and dangerous trade routes. The spice trade, in particular, involves goods that travel thousands of miles from Asia to Europe through multiple intermediaries. Each step in the journey adds cost and risk. A shipment of pepper or cinnamon might change hands a dozen times before reaching its final destination, and each transaction increases the possibility of fraud or loss. The demand for luxury goods is highly volatile and dependent on fashion, politics, and economic conditions. A change in royal preferences can destroy the market for certain products overnight. Political conflicts can cut off supply routes and make certain goods unavailable. The social status of merchants is ambiguous and often problematic. You're wealthier than most peasants and craftsmen, but you're not part of the noble class. The church teaches that commerce is spiritually dangerous, and that merchants are likely to be damned because of their pursuit of profit. This social ambiguity affects every aspect of your life. You can't buy land in many places because land ownership is restricted to nobles. You can't marry into noble families because they consider trade to be beneath their dignity. You can't hold political office because merchants are considered untrustworthy and self-interested. The physical demands of medieval commerce are enormous. As a merchant, you must personally supervise the loading and unloading of goods, negotiate with suppliers and customers, and travel long distances under difficult conditions. There are no telephones, no email, no way to conduct business remotely. This means that you're constantly on the road, exposed to all the dangers and discomforts of medieval travel. You sleep in flea-infested inns, eat questionable food, and drink contaminated water. You're vulnerable to bandits, accidents, and disease every day. The stress of medieval commerce is intense and unrelenting. Your entire fortune can be lost in a single transaction, and there's no safety net to protect you from bankruptcy. The constant worry about theft, fraud, and other disasters creates a level of anxiety that would be difficult for modern people to endure. Now let us imagine that you've found yourself in perhaps the most privileged position available in medieval society, that of a scholar or learned clerk. You might think this would be the easiest role to adapt to, given that modern people value education and intellectual pursuits. But as we'll discover, the pursuit of knowledge in medieval times was fraught with dangers, limitations, and challenges that would make even the most dedicated modern academic long for their comfortable university office and high-speed internet connection. The year is 1200, and you're a clerk in the Cathedral School of Chartres, one of the most prestigious centers of learning in medieval Europe. You've managed to achieve what only a tiny fraction of the population ever could. You can read and write. You have access to books, and you're part of the intellectual elite that preserves and transmits knowledge. Yet even in this privileged position, your daily life would be a constant struggle against ignorance, superstition, and the harsh realities of medieval existence. Your day begins, like everyone else's, before dawn with the ringing of church bells calling the faithful to prayer. But unlike the peasants and merchants we've followed in previous chapters, your first obligation is not to physical labor or commercial transactions, but to the divine office, the cycle of prayers that structures the day for all clergy and religious scholars. You stumble from your hard, narrow bed in the dormitory you share with other clerics and students. The room is freezing cold, even in summer, because there is no heating except for a small brazier that is allowed only during the coldest winter months. The windows are small and covered with oiled parchment rather than glass, providing minimal light and no protection from the elements. After morning prayers, you make your way to the scriptorium, the room where the real work of medieval scholarship takes place. This is where books are copied, illuminated, and preserved, the heart of medieval intellectual life. But the reality of working in a medieval scriptorium would shock you with its primitive conditions and mind-numbing tedium. The scriptorium is a large, cold room with small windows that provide minimal natural light. There's no artificial lighting except for candles, which are expensive and dangerous. Most of your work must be done during daylight hours, and even then, the light is often inadequate for the detailed work of copying manuscripts. Your workspace consists of a slanted wooden desk, a hard wooden stool, and a few basic tools, quill pens, ink, a knife for sharpening quills and scraping errors, and perhaps a ruler for keeping lines straight. There are no ergonomic considerations, no adjustable furniture, no concern for your physical comfort during long hours of detailed work. The books you're recopying are not printed volumes but handwritten, manuscripts on parchment or vellum animal skins that have been specially prepared for writing. Each book represents months or years of painstaking labor by previous scribes, and every copy you make requires the same enormous investment of time and effort. The process of copying a book is incredibly slow and demanding. You must carefully read each word in the original, understand its meaning, and then reproduce it exactly in your own handwriting. A single page might take an entire day to complete, and a complete book could require months or even years of work. The physical demands of this work are severe. You spend hours each day hunched over your desk, straining your eyes to read faded or poorly written text, and carefully forming each letter with your quill pen. Your back aches constantly, your eyes burn from the strain, and your hand cramps from gripping the pen. The materials you work with are expensive and precious. Parchment is made from animal skins and costs more than most people earn in a month. Ink is made from various substances including iron gall, which is corrosive and can eat through the parchment if not properly prepared. A single mistake can ruin hours of work and waste valuable materials. The books you're copying contain the accumulated knowledge of centuries, but much of this knowledge is incomplete, inaccurate, or simply wrong. Medieval scholars have no way to verify information, no experimental methods for testing theories, and no systematic approach to distinguishing fact from fiction. The classical texts that form the foundation of medieval learning have been copied and recopied so many times that errors have crept in at every stage. Words have been misread, passages have been omitted or inserted, and entire sections have been corrupted beyond recognition. You're often copying errors rather than preserving truth. The scientific knowledge available to you is a mixture of classical learning, religious doctrine, and folk wisdom that bears little resemblance to modern science. You believe that the Earth is the center of the universe, that the human body contains 4 humors that determine health and personality, and that natural phenomena are caused by supernatural forces. Medical knowledge is particularly problematic. The texts you're recopying describe treatments that are often more dangerous than the diseases they were supposed to cure. Bloodletting, purging, and other harmful practices are considered standard medical procedures. The concept of infection is unknown, and surgical procedures are performed without anesthesia or antiseptic precautions. The preservation of knowledge is a constant struggle against the forces of decay and destruction. Books are vulnerable to fire, flood, insects, and rodents. A single accident can destroy centuries of accumulated learning. Many classical texts have already been lost forever, and more disappear every year. The cost of books makes them accessible only to the wealthy and powerful. A single book might cost more than a craftsman earns in a year, making private libraries impossible for all but the richest individuals. Most scholars have access only to the books owned by their institution, severely limiting their research possibilities. The teaching methods used in medieval schools are based on rote memorization rather than critical thinking. Students are expected to memorize large portions of texts without necessarily understanding their meaning. Questioning or challenging the content is discouraged and often punished. The political constraints on medieval scholarship are severe and ever-present. The Church controls most centers of learning and determines what can be studied and taught. Questioning religious doctrine is not just academically unacceptable, it's literally heretical and can result in excommunication, imprisonment, or death. The lack of printing means that new ideas spread very slowly, if at all. A breakthrough in one location might take decades to reach scholars in other places, and by then, the information might be garbled or incomplete. The pace of intellectual progress is glacially slow. The experimental approach that drives modern science is not just unknown, it's actively discouraged. The medieval worldview emphasizes authority and tradition over observation and experimentation. Testing ideas against reality is seen as presumptuous and potentially dangerous. As our gentle journey through the harsh realities of medieval life draws to a close, let us take a moment to reflect on the extraordinary distance humanity has traveled from those dark and difficult times to the relative comfort and security of our modern world. We've walked in the shoes of peasants and crusaders, merchants and scholars, and in each case, we've discovered that medieval life would challenge us in ways we can barely imagine. The peasant's daily struggle for survival, The Crusaders' terrible journey to the Holy Land, the merchants' dangerous trading expeditions, and the scholars' battle against ignorance and superstition. All of these experiences would test us beyond our limits. Think about the peasant we met at the beginning of our journey, struggling to survive in a world where a simple cut could become a fatal infection, where hunger was a constant companion, and where the basic dignities we take for granted, privacy, cleanliness, choice, were completely absent. That peasant's daily struggle for survival makes our worst modern problems seem manageable by comparison. Remember the crusader we followed on his terrible journey to the Holy Land, facing disease, starvation, and violence on a scale that would traumatize even the most hardened modern soldier. His ordeal reminds us that the religious and political freedoms we enjoy today were won through centuries of conflict and suffering. Consider the merchant we accompanied on his dangerous trading expeditions, risking everything on every transaction in a world without insurance, reliable transportation, or legal protections. His struggles remind us of how much we depend on the complex systems of law, finance, and technology that make modern commerce possible. Reflect on the scholar we observed in his cold scriptorium, painstakingly copying books by hand while struggling against ignorance, superstition, and religious orthodoxy. His dedication reminds us of how precious our access to information and our freedom to think and learn really are. Each of these medieval people faced challenges that would defeat most of us within days or hours. They lived with levels of discomfort, danger, and uncertainty that we can barely comprehend. They endured physical hardships that would hospitalize us and psychological stresses that would break our spirits. Yet they persevered. They survived. They built families, communities, and civilizations despite obstacles that seem insurmountable. They created art, preserved knowledge, and maintained hope in the face of overwhelming adversity. They laid the foundations for everything we value in our modern world. The technologies we use without thinking, electricity, running water, modern medicine, rapid transportation, instant communication, represent the accumulated achievements of countless generations who refuse to accept the limitations of their time. The freedoms we enjoy, religious liberty, political participation, economic opportunity, intellectual inquiry, were won through centuries of struggle against ignorance, oppression, and tyranny. The safety and security we take for granted, protection from disease, violence, and natural disaster, were built through the patient work of millions of people who gradually developed the knowledge. Institutions and technologies that shield us from the harsh realities that our ancestors faced every day. Even our problems, real and serious as they may be, pale in comparison to the daily struggles of medieval life. Our worst economic difficulties are minor inconveniences compared to medieval famines. Our most serious health challenges are manageable with modern medicine that would seem miraculous to medieval physicians. Our political disagreements, however heated, take place within systems that protect us from the violence and chaos that characterized medieval politics. This perspective doesn't minimize our contemporary challenges or suggest that we should be satisfied with injustice or inequality. But it does provide context for understanding how much progress humanity has made and how much we have to be grateful for. The next time you feel overwhelmed by the pace of modern life, remember that medieval people lived with constant uncertainty about their survival. The next time you complain about technology, remember that medieval people had to do everything by hand using primitive tools. The next time you worry about your health, remember that medieval people faced disease and injury with no effective treatments. Most importantly, the next time you go to sleep in a warm, safe, comfortable bed, remember that you're living a life of luxury that medieval kings and queens could only dream of. You have access to more information than the greatest medieval scholars, more security than the most powerful medieval nobles, more comfort than the wealthiest medieval merchants, and more freedom than any medieval person, regardless of their social status. As you drift off to sleep tonight, warm and safe in your comfortable bed, Take a moment to feel grateful for the long journey that brought humanity from the brutal world of medieval times to the relative paradise of today. Think about the countless individuals who contributed to this progress, not just the famous kings and queens, saints and scholars, whose names we remember, but the ordinary people whose daily struggles and small victories gradually built the foundation of our modern world. We are their legacy, their vindication, their reward for enduring the unendurable and achieving the impossible. We live the lives they dreamed of but could never have. We enjoy the freedoms they fought for but could never experience. We benefit from the knowledge they preserved but could never fully use. Sleep well, dream peacefully, and wake tomorrow with a heart full of gratitude for the extraordinary privilege of living in this remarkable time in human history. You are living a life that countless generations could only dream of, in a world that represents the fulfillment of humanity's deepest hopes and highest aspirations. Sweet dreams, and remember, you wouldn't last a day in medieval times, but you don't have to. You're here now, in the best time to be alive that has ever existed.